My name is Howard Wilson. I turned 81 last April. I live in a single-story house just outside Pittsburgh, in a neighborhood where the sidewalks have cracked with age and the trees have grown into giants that seem to lean toward the past. I've lived in this house for 43 years, longer than any one man should spend in one place. It's the home where my wife Marlene and I raised our son and daughter, where she died in her sleep 7 winters ago, and where silence has grown louder with each passing day. The rooms echo with memories I no longer trust. The smell of her lavender hand cream still lingers faintly in the hallway closet, even though I haven't opened it in months. Sometimes I'll stand at the threshold of the bedroom and stare at the bed, still made on her side with the same quilt she stitched when our children were still little. I never had the heart to move her things. It feels like treason. I wasn't always like this, of course. There was a time when my days were filled with meaning. I served in the Army in my 20s, came home and put myself through college, and later taught American history at the high school for nearly 30 years. I was a patient man, a man of principles. I believed in respect and hard work, in loyalty to one's family, and the idea that if you gave love and effort, you'd eventually receive them in kind. I carried that belief like a torch through life, even when it burned my hands. I taught my students to be curious and kind, and I tried to do the same with my own children. Though now I wonder if I was too soft, too trusting, too slow to see the rust forming in the gears of our relationship. Since retiring, my world has become narrower with each year. My friends have all gone, some to nursing homes, most to cemeteries. The phone barely rings. My knees ache more than they bend, and I don't drive anymore. I gave up the Buick after a small accident in a grocery store parking lot. No one was hurt, but I knew the time had come. My daughter Grace insisted it was for the best. "It's not safe anymore, Dad," she said, handing me a new pill organizer, as if to seal the deal. "Let us take care of you now." Let. As if care was something they were fighting to provide. I've learned to be careful when someone insists they're doing something for your own good. There's usually a contract or a condition not far behind. Grace and her husband Mitchell live about 40 minutes away in a comfortable suburb with freshly painted fences and mailboxes shaped like birds. They have 2 boys, Samuel and Caleb, my grandsons, though I've seen less of them in recent years than I see of the squirrels that gather on my back porch. Grace calls me once every week or two, always with the same sequence of questions. Are you taking your meds? Are you eating? Have you had any dizzy spells? I answer dutifully, like a schoolboy reporting to the principal. Sometimes she comes by with a bag of groceries, cans of soup, rice crackers, tuna, sometimes dented, sometimes expired, which she unloads without ceremony before hurrying back to her real life. She never lingers long enough for coffee. Mitchell never comes. He doesn't like the smell of old houses, though I suspect what he really doesn't like is the presence of a man he can't manipulate. I don't mean to sound ungrateful. I understand they have busy lives. Grace works in corporate HR, whatever that means now, and Mitchell owns some kind of small logistics company. They're always traveling or posting vacation photos on social media, wine tastings in Napa, a cabin in Vermont, conferences in Florida. There was a time years ago when they used to invite me along, or at least talk to me like I still had a mind of my own. But that time has passed. Now, when they speak to me, it's as though I'm already halfway into the grave. Grace addresses me in the same voice she uses for her dogs. Careful, cheerful, vaguely condescending. Mitchell, on the rare occasions he bothers to look me in the eye, acts like he's sizing up a piece of furniture that might collapse at any moment. I've learned to swallow the indignities. I keep telling myself it's temporary, that it could be worse, that it's better than a nursing home. But lately, I've begun to wonder, not about the quality of their care or lack thereof, no, that much is obvious, but about their motives. There's something in the way Grace asks certain questions, in the way Mitchell once idly asked if I still had the deed to the house. I played dumb. I didn't mention that Marlene and I paid off the mortgage in 1992, or that I still have all the documents, filed neatly in the old green cabinet in the study, or that I know damn well what it means when someone asks you to sign just a couple of routine forms. I suppose the worst part of growing old is realizing that you've become a liability to the people you once carried on your back. They see the gray in your hair and forget the man you used to be. They see the tremor in your hand and not the years you held theirs without question. And yet, I try not to resent them. I tell myself Grace is just tired, overworked, misled by Mitchell. I tell myself the boys will come around, that maybe one day they'll want to hear the stories I still remember, about the war, about their grandmother, about how their father once cried over a lost toy truck. But I know the truth. I've known it for some time, and I've tried to ignore it. My daughter no longer sees me as her father. I'm a responsibility, a problem, a puzzle to solve, or better yet, to put away on a shelf. She doesn't ask me what I want. She tells me what I need. And each visit, each call, each plastic bag of expired groceries feels less like love and more like bookkeeping, like checking a box on some invisible list. Called Dad, brought soup, moving on. Still, I endure. I water the plants. I read the same history books for the 100th time. I sit on the porch and watch the shadows move across the lawn. I have my routines, and I cling to them like a lifeline, because the one thing I still have, the only thing they haven't taken, is my mind, and I intend to use it, because I have begun to suspect that they are planning something. And if they are, they'll soon learn that this old man is not quite as soft as he seems. It began with a sharp pain in my left arm one morning in late October, the kind of dull, dragging ache that stretches from shoulder to wrist and settles like a stone in the chest. I was in the kitchen, opening a jar of marmalade that had been sitting on the counter for weeks, when the sensation overtook me, not a stab, but a heavy compression, like someone was pushing down on my ribs with a slow, relentless pressure. I froze. My hands trembled. My breath shortened. I reached out, gripping the edge of the sink, waiting for it to pass. For a moment I stood there, paralyzed in the quiet. The only sound, the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the wall clock. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the pain receded. Not gone, just lurking deeper. I told myself it was probably indigestion, a pulled muscle, nothing more. I even laughed out loud. The sound strange and flat in the empty kitchen, as if laughter had no business being there anymore. But something about the moment lingered. I made myself a cup of tea, forcing my hands to stay steady, and sat at the table with a notebook I hadn't opened in months. My handwriting looked different, weaker somehow, and that scared me more than the pain. I wrote down the time, 8:43 a.m., and the word pressure. That's all I managed before I set the pen down. I stared at the cup of tea, untouched, and realized I wasn't hungry anymore. It wasn't the first strange episode I'd had that year. A few weeks earlier, I'd blacked out for what must have been a few seconds while walking from the porch to the mailbox. I woke up sitting on the grass with no recollection of how I got there. I'd told no one, not even Grace. Especially not Grace. She had a way of seizing on anything that proved her right about my frailty, like a hawk spotting movement in the brush. I had no doubt she'd use it as another argument for transitional housing, her polite term for putting me somewhere she could visit on weekends, or, more likely, forget altogether. That evening, the pain returned. Sharper this time, less forgiving. It caught me as I bent to turn off the porch light, and I collapsed into the chair by the door, clutching my side. I couldn't breathe properly. My mind raced with memories of old Army drills, the time they made us memorize emergency protocol, how to diagnose a heart attack, left arm, chest pressure, shallow breathing, nausea. I had 4 out of 5. I remember thinking, this might be the last time I see this house. That thought scared me more than death itself. I reached for the cordless phone and dialed 911. The ambulance came quickly, lights flashing against the dark trees lining the street. The paramedics were young, polite, efficient. They didn't talk down to me. One of them, a girl named Ashley, held my wrist as she took my pulse and said gently, "You did the right thing, Mr. Wilson." I almost cried then, not from fear, but from the simple kindness in her voice. The kind of kindness I hadn't felt in so long that I'd begun to question whether it still existed. At the hospital, they ran tests, drew blood, did scans. The results were inconclusive. Not a full-blown heart attack, but not a false alarm either. The doctor, a tired-looking man with kind eyes and an efficient manner, told me I'd had a minor cardiac episode and that I should not be living alone. "You need supervision," he said, looking over his glasses. "You're lucky this one wasn't worse." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I knew what was coming. Sure enough, Grace arrived the next morning, with Mitchell in tow. She wore that tight smile I've come to associate with bad news, and a scarf she didn't take off, even in the warmth of my hospital room. Mitchell stood behind her like a bodyguard, arms folded, saying nothing. "Dad," Grace said, "we're going to bring you home with us for a while, just until you recover fully." Home. I wanted to ask whose home she meant, because I was sure she didn't mean mine. I looked at Mitchell, who avoided my gaze, and I knew this wasn't a suggestion. It was an extraction. I was being moved, relocated, quietly transferred like a liability on a spreadsheet. "Only for a few weeks," Grace added quickly, as if she sensed my resistance. "You'll have your own room. I've already set it up. It's better than being alone here or in that cold old house." She made my house sound like a broken-down shack, when in truth it was cleaner than hers and warmer than the tone of her voice had been in years. Mitchell finally spoke. "We'll pick you up tomorrow. Just pack a small bag. We'll handle the rest later." Handle. I knew what that meant. They were going to go through my things. Sort. Box discard. Decide what was worth keeping. My life, curated by people who hadn't asked me a personal question in years. Still, I agreed. Not because I wanted to, not because I trusted them, but because I had no strength left in that moment to fight. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd be back home before the first frost. I told myself I'd bide my time, rest, recover, and then return. But even as I nodded, something in me tightened. I saw it in Mitchell's smirk, in the relief behind Grace's false cheer. This wasn't about recovery. This was about control, about convenience, about them removing me from the equation before I could become an inconvenience. And in that sterile room that smelled of bleach and resignation, I made myself a quiet promise. They would regret underestimating me. When they left, I asked the nurse to help me up. She was hesitant, but obliging. I wanted to walk the hall just once. I needed to feel my feet under me, to remind myself that I was still capable of movement, of purpose, of thought, that I hadn't yet become the frail old man they assumed I was. As I moved slowly down the corridor, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflective glass of a door. I looked tired, older than I remembered, yes, but I was still there. My spine was straight, my eyes were clear, my mind was intact, and soon, very soon, I would need all of it, because I was walking into something far worse than a heart condition. I was walking into their house, into their version of care. And I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't meant to walk out again the same man, if at all. The day Grace and Mitchell brought me to their house, the sky was overcast in a way that made everything seem flatter and more lifeless than usual. The kind of gray that dulls the light and bleaches color out of the world, leaving behind only quiet suspicion. The drive was silent for most of the way. Grace sat in the passenger seat, fidgeting with her phone, replying to texts or pretending to. Mitchell drove with the sort of mechanical calm that suggested he had made this trip many times in his head and wanted to be done with it quickly. I sat in the back, staring out the window at roads I once knew well, but that now seemed strangely foreign. Perhaps it was the awareness that I was no longer returning as a visitor or guest, but as cargo, a patient, a responsibility. I held a small duffel bag on my lap with a change of clothes, my medications, and my shaving kit. Everything else, they'd said, could be taken care of later. I already knew what that meant. Later usually meant never. Or worse, sold off, given away, boxed up and forgotten like old holiday decorations. When we pulled into their driveway, I felt something tighten in my stomach. Their house was large, white-bricked, with a double garage and freshly landscaped flower beds. It looked like a catalog picture of middle-class prosperity, neat and sterile, the kind of house where everything had a label and everyone knew their role. Grace got out first and went to unlock the front door while Mitchell opened the trunk. He didn't help me out of the car. I wasn't expecting him to. Inside, the air smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and new carpet, but under it, something else, a sort of manufactured cheerfulness that felt too deliberate. like someone trying to hide a stain with perfume. "We've set you up downstairs for now," Grace said as she led me through the hall, "just until the guest room is finished." I said nothing. We passed the kitchen, a cold, immaculate space with chrome appliances and a gleaming marble island. It looked less like somewhere people cooked and more like a photo shoot. I followed her through a side door, down a narrow staircase that creaked only once. The basement was finished, technically. There was carpet, a dehumidifier in the corner, and a standing lamp. But it was unmistakably a basement. No windows, low ceiling, a faint, musty scent they hadn't quite scrubbed out. Against one wall stood a metal frame cot with a thin mattress covered by a blanket that looked like it had been dug out of storage. A small folding table sat beside it, and an armchair that was clearly once part of a living room set but had since been demoted. "We'll get you something more comfortable soon," Grace said, almost as an afterthought. "This is just for now. We wanted to make sure you had your own space." I nodded, because anything else would have required energy I didn't have. She helped me set down my bag, pointed to a mini fridge in the corner that hummed faintly. "We stocked it for you, snacks, some drinks, yogurt, that sort of thing. There's a bathroom down the hall. It's shared, but the boys usually use the one upstairs." She smiled again, that same brittle expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Try to take it easy, okay? We're just glad you're here." When she left, closing the door behind her, I sat down on the cot and listened to the sound of footsteps upstairs, muffled voices, a door opening, laughter. The weight of the silence around me deepened. I looked around the basement, at the bare walls, the box of old toys in the corner, the laundry machines humming a few feet away, and I realized I had been placed where the rest of the clutter went. Not upstairs, not in view. Below, contained, forgotten when convenient. Dinner the first night was served in the kitchen. Grace called me up, using a tone that reminded me of someone addressing a child who had wandered out of sight. I climbed the stairs slowly, my knees stiff, the railing slick with polish, and entered a room already halfway through a meal. Mitchell and the boys sat at the table, plates in front of them. Grace gestured to an empty seat at the far end. "There you are. We started without you. Hope that's okay." I nodded and sat. On my plate was a piece of baked chicken and some vegetables, lukewarm. No one looked up. The boys were watching something on a tablet propped between the salt and pepper shakers. Mitchell scrolled through his phone. Grace poured herself wine, but didn't offer me any. "Mitchell cooked tonight," she said brightly, as if this was an accomplishment worth applause. "He's trying out new recipes." I took a bite. The chicken was dry, the vegetables tasted of freezer burn. I said nothing. Later, when I opened the fridge in the basement to get a bottle of water, I noticed the dates on some of the items they had stocked for me. The yogurt was 3 weeks expired. The cheese had spots of blue. Even the orange juice had started to separate, the pulp congealing into a thick, unappetizing layer at the bottom of the bottle. I checked every item, one by one. Everything was expired or close to it. And then I saw it, a container of prepackaged lasagna with a handwritten label in Grace's neat script. "For Dad." The smiley face struck me like a slap. I stood there, staring at that cheerful mark of mockery. And for a long moment I felt nothing. Not sadness, not anger, just a strange, heavy emptiness, like something sacred inside me had quietly died without ceremony. The next morning, Mitchell came downstairs while I was trying to stretch my legs. He carried a cardboard box and a clipboard. "Just a few forms to go over," he said without looking up. "Insurance stuff. Don't worry, Grace already filled out most of it. Just need your signature." I asked what it was for. He mumbled something about medical directives, power of attorney, standard stuff for emergencies. I looked at the papers. They were long, dense, and full of legal language. "Take your time," he said. "No rush. Just easier if we get it all out of the way now." I didn't sign. I told him I'd like to look it over more closely. He didn't argue, but his jaw tightened, and he left the box on the table as he walked away. That night, I read the papers slowly. There were documents naming Grace as my financial guardian in the event of mental incapacitation. Others authorized Mitchell to make medical decisions on my behalf. I found a clause buried in paragraph 9 of one form that would have granted them access to my bank accounts for the purpose of elder care and housing transition. My hands trembled as I turned the pages. I thought of the expired yogurt, the lasagna, the cot in the basement. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't neglect. This was a campaign, a quiet, polite, well-dressed attempt to erase me without ever admitting they wanted me gone. The next morning, I told Grace I wouldn't be signing anything until I'd spoken to my own lawyer. Her face changed. She smiled still, but something behind her eyes turned cold. "Of course, Dad, if that makes you feel better. We just want what's best for you." That phrase again, what's best for you, always uttered by people who have already decided that your choices are irrelevant. The rest of the week passed in a fog of small humiliations. They began double-dosing my medication just in case. One night, they turned off the Wi-Fi password, and when I asked about it, Mitchell shrugged and said the boys had homework. Grace replaced my toothbrush with a children's model. Easier on the gums. She brought down slippers with thick soles, like orthopedic props, and removed my regular shoes. "You don't need to be going outside," she said when I asked about a walk. "The air is cold. We don't want you slipping." And then came the laughter. One night I heard Mitchell through the floorboards. "Did you see the look on his face when he opened the fridge? I swear, I thought he was going to cry over yogurt." Grace laughed too. "Well, he should be grateful. At least we're not putting him in one of those homes with plastic sheets and bingo cards. Not yet, anyway. Not yet." I sat there in the basement, lights off, the lasagna still unopened in the fridge, and I realized what I was facing. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't recovery. This was exile. They were softening me up, not through violence, but through belittlement, through attrition, wearing down the last of my dignity until I signed away the last pieces of my autonomy. And for the first time in years, I felt something stir deep inside me, a resolve, a quiet fury. They thought they were feeding me expired food and cheap sympathy. They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought I was too old to fight. But what they didn't realize, not yet, was that I had seen deception before. I had taught history for 30 years. I knew all about quiet betrayals and disguised intentions, and if they wanted to treat me like a relic, then I would remind them exactly what relics are made of. Because some old things, once provoked, don't break. They burn. It was a Thursday morning when I found Mitchell in my room, the basement technically, but they always referred to it as your room, as if that made the insult softer. I hadn't heard him come down, but when I stepped out of the bathroom, he was there, crouched by the duffel bag I kept near the cot. My papers were laid out beside him, my notepad, a printout of my bank statements I'd requested weeks earlier, the folder with my pension documents. He didn't even flinch when he saw me. "Just checking on a few things," he said casually, as if rifling through someone's private effects was a reasonable gesture of concern. "You left these unsecured, not safe, could have been thrown away by mistake." I didn't answer. I walked over slowly, knelt down without looking at him, and began gathering the papers. My hands were steadier than I expected. He didn't move, just watched me with that unreadable smirk of his, the one that always looked too rehearsed to be sincere and too smug to be benign. "You know," he said, "it's kind of lucky you're here with us. A lot of guys your age don't get this kind of support." I didn't speak. Some end up in government homes, run by underpaid staff, cold, sterile places, not like this. "Here, you've got family." I stacked the papers back into the folder, stood up, and stared at him. "Please don't come down here uninvited again." My voice was low, calm, deliberate. He raised his eyebrows, but said nothing more. When he left, I locked the door from the inside. It was a flimsy lock, more symbolic than anything, but it gave me a brief illusion of control. That afternoon I checked the envelope I'd hidden beneath the armchair cushion, the one with my original documents: driver's license, health insurance card, birth certificate, and the one that mattered most, my house deed. It was still there. But when I opened my wallet, the credit card I'd tucked behind the last photo of Marlene was gone. At first, I thought I'd misplaced it. I searched the room, turned everything inside out, the drawers, my jacket, the bag, nothing. It had been there 2 days ago when I ordered a subscription for a weekly paper, something to keep my mind occupied. Now it was gone. I didn't ask them. I knew what the answer would be: a shrug from Mitchell, a patronizing smile from Grace, some excuse about how I'd probably misplaced it. But I hadn't. And that's when I knew they had started taking pieces of me. That night, they brought me dinner: prepackaged soup and toast, served with a forced warmth. Grace handed me the tray and lingered, as if waiting to see if I'd say something. "Everything okay, Dad?" she asked. I looked at her long and hard and saw the faintest flicker of guilt, or perhaps fear, beneath her perfectly neutral expression. "Fine," I said. "Everything's just fine." She smiled. "We care about you. We're doing our best." I nodded. "I know." And I did know. I knew exactly what they were doing. After they went upstairs, I waited. I listened to the rhythm of the house, the creaks of their footsteps, the closing of doors, the murmur of the television. I waited until well after midnight. Then, as quietly as I could, I dressed, gathered my documents, and climbed the stairs. I moved slowly, carefully, not because of my age, but because I couldn't afford to be caught. The front door was locked, of course, but I knew they left a spare key in the third planter by the porch. Grace had mentioned it once without thinking. I stepped out into the cold night, heart pounding, not from fear, but from adrenaline. I walked 3 blocks to the all-night gas station. The boy behind the counter looked up, surprised. I asked to use the phone and called the only number I knew would still matter, the bank. I told them I'd lost my card. I requested a full block on the account. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. The woman on the line confirmed my identity, asked a few security questions, and processed the request. "Is there anything else we can help you with, Mr. Wilson?" she asked. "Not tonight," I said, "but thank you." When I returned to the house, the lights were off. No one had noticed I was gone. I went back to the basement, locked the door, and sat in the dark, wide awake. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat with the realization that I was now fighting for the preservation of who I was, my autonomy, my memory, my right to exist on my own terms. The next day, Grace brought down a manila envelope. "We need to talk, Dad," she said, her tone tighter than usual. "There's been some confusion with your finances. A couple charges the bank flagged. We think someone might be trying to access your accounts. Mitchell called the bank, but they wouldn't talk to him." "That's not safe, Dad. We need to sort this out together." I opened the envelope after she left. Inside were more forms, new ones, more explicit. One of them listed Mitchell as co-executor and authorized financial representative. Another granted Grace emergency authority over all health and housing decisions. I smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had seen the battlefield form and recognized the enemy's desperation. That evening, I left again, this time to the public library, an old building I used to frequent before everything in my life began to shrink. I found a corner computer, logged into my old email, and began contacting the people I knew still existed. My former lawyer, a veteran friend who now ran a small property management business, the notary who helped me update my will after Marlene's death. I wrote carefully, clearly, outlining my concerns. I asked for help, not out of helplessness, but out of strategy. I knew I could not win this alone. When I returned to the house, the door was unlocked. My heart skipped. I stepped inside and found Mitchell sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in his hand. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me like he'd been waiting all evening. "We're trying to help you," he said finally. "We're not the bad guys here." I didn't respond. I simply walked past him, down the stairs into the basement. He didn't follow. That night, I began writing everything down, every conversation, every detail, every item that had been moved or taken. I dated each entry. I logged their behaviors. I built a record, a defense, yes, but also a story. Because I realized then that this wasn't just about survival. It was about telling the truth. And the truth, once spoken clearly enough, has a way of burning through even the most polite and well-dressed deceptions. They had pushed too far. They had mistaken my silence for surrender. And now They had given me a reason to fight. It was a rainy Sunday, the kind of day when the sky threatens all morning and then lets out a long, quiet rain in the afternoon, drumming gently on the basement ceiling as if it were testing my endurance. The house above me felt empty, but the sounds of life continued, the hum of the boiler, the muted voices drifting from the living room, intermittent bursts of laughter. They were always laughing now, as if they believed I couldn't hear them, or wouldn't understand, or simply didn't matter. I counted the beams of water making slow streaks across the small, high basement window, feeling each one like an accusation. My hands found their way to the ledger I'd begun, the handwritten log of everything they'd taken, every indignity. I flipped through the pages, the lines of ink, thick with awareness, with grief, with something close to righteous fury. It started with the lease of my car. I found the bill tucked into the basement trash can one evening, not shredded, not hidden, just discarded like a crumpled reminder. The car I'd paid for outright, that had carried Marlene and me across states in summers when everything seemed possible. The last check, the ownership papers, all gone. My breath caught at the memory of driving her home from the hospital. How she'd slept in the passenger seat, head resting on my arm, and I stood there in the dim light of the basement, staring at that discarded paper and realized that they were systematically erasing my agency, rendering me fragile not through force, but erasure. At dinner, the tables turned. That night, Grace insisted I join them in the dining room. She had lit candles, too many, and placed a salad bowl between us. I sat, but the food was familiar yet wrong. Salad with wilted lettuce and soggy croutons, sprinkled with dressing that had separated into a puddle of oil and water. "I thought you'd like something light," she said in that tone of feigned care. I looked at her, really looked, and saw how the tremor in her voice betrayed exhaustion or guilt. I took a bite. The crouton crunched unpleasantly. The lettuce was limp. The dressing tasted stale. I chewed slowly, swallowed, and leaned back. "It's perfect," I said, though it wasn't. Behind me, the boys whispered something and giggled. I pretended not to hear, but I did. I began to see their cruelty not as thoughtlessness, but as rehearsal, practice for what might come next. After dinner, Mitchell stayed behind with me in the dining room, ostensibly to talk logistics. He didn't turn on a lamp. The only light came from the candles and the rain-streaked window behind him. The air felt thick. He said they wanted to start consolidating things, my medical records, my mail, utilities, any subscriptions. They'd already taken care of the bank. But what about my name on the title deeds, the house, the car, the utility bills? I looked at him and said nothing. His face paled slightly. He swallowed. "We're just trying to help, Dad." I found myself leaning forward into the warm candlelight and saying, "You're not helping. You're finishing me off." His mouth opened, closed. He looked away first. When I left the room, I grabbed a note from the table, an envelope addressed to the notary I had contacted earlier, and took it downstairs. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed upright on the cot, running through the evidence in my ledger, the expired-dated yogurt, the lasagna, the stolen car papers, the forms, the draft notices, the discrepancies, and I knew they would escalate further. So I prepared. I found a small blank journal in the folds beneath the chair, and I turned its first page into a manifesto. I wrote down who I was, not the old man they portrayed, but Howard Wilson, teacher, veteran, husband, father, grandfather, and I wrote down what I would not surrender: my dignity, my mind, my right to speak my truth. I tucked the journal into the hidden envelope with copies of the most critical documents, my original ID, the deed to the house, and I slid it under the floorboards behind the mattress, where even they would not find it, without intent. The next morning, Grace descended the basement stairs while I was reading my own writing. She leaned against the door frame, arms folded, watching me. I looked up. "I found another thing today," she said, her voice unsteady. "You didn't use that car much, did you, Dad?" "It would save us money if we returned it or transferred it." I understood that we meant them. I nodded slowly. "Maybe it's for the best," I said, though every word felt heavy with resistance. She turned and left without another word. It was the moment they began to rewrite my words through me, suggesting my consent where none existed. Later that day, while they were busy upstairs, I quietly called the lawyer, the one I'd contacted through the library computer. My hand shook, not with fear, but with anticipation of reclaiming something. I explained the situation, read from my ledger, emphasizing the patterns of manipulation and the documented missing assets. She replied with calm disbelief, then reassurance. She said she'd come tomorrow, and she'd bring someone to record everything. Legal official. That night I slept, for the first time in days, lulled by the promise of validation. When the lawyer arrived the following morning, Grace answered the door with a controlled smile. The lawyer's eyes were sharp, professional. In my basement room, we went through the records again, witness statements, copies of logs, photos of the expired food packages with dates marked. The lawyer scrutinized the ledger, asked questions, and took notes. Grace hovered by the staircase, her face pale. Mitchell trailed behind her. At some point I heard Grace say, in a low voice, "What are you doing, Dad? This isn't necessary." But it was necessary. I looked at her and at Mitchell, standing side by side like co-conspirators, and something shifted. I felt a weight lift off me, not physical weight, but existential. I was no longer framed by them. I was reframing myself. After they left, the lawyer handed me a card. "I'll be in touch," she said. "One more thing. You should know I've already alerted Adult Protective Services. There are protocols. This type of behavior, withholding medication, restricting access to finances, isolating someone, all fall under elder abuse. They'll investigate." The words settled over me like a cool blanket. Not salvation, but a weapon. That afternoon, as rain began again against the basement window, I sat on the cot and looked at my log. It no longer felt like a collection of wounds, but a blueprint for survival. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I had begun to carve a path out of erasure. And I knew this. They thought they were silencing me gently, but what they had done was awaken me. And old wounds, once reopened, do not heal softly. They transform into fire, and I was ready to burn. The culmination didn't arrive in a moment of shouting or violence, as I had once imagined it might. There were no slammed doors or broken plates, no dramatic accusations or tearful confrontations. It came instead in silence, in the gentle shift of atmosphere that precedes a storm, a change so subtle you don't realize it has arrived until you are already standing in the rain. I had been waiting, not passively, but with the patience of someone who understands that justice, when it comes, must be undeniable. I had built my records, contacted the lawyer, secured my documents, withdrawn what money I could from accounts they hadn't touched, and arranged for all remaining funds to be frozen under legal protection. I had done all of this under their noses, beneath the weight of their smiles and veiled suggestions that perhaps I was losing my mind. And so, when the call came, I was ready. It was a Tuesday morning, gray and cool, the air inside the basement heavy with the scent of mildew and detergent. Grace entered with 2 cups of tea, placing one on the table beside my ledger, and sat across from me with what I suppose was intended to be kindness on her face. "We've been thinking," she began, her fingers wrapped too tightly around the porcelain mug, "about your living situation, about the future. Mitchell found a place not too far from here, a really nice assisted living center. They have good staff, a nice community. I think you'd like it. And we'd visit, of course." I stared at her, letting the silence stretch until she began to squirm. "It's not a decision we've made lightly. We just think, with everything going on, it might be time." I picked up the cup and drank slowly. The tea was cold. I set it down, looked her straight in the eye, and said, "I know what you're doing." Her face changed instantly. A flinch, not of guilt, but of realization. "What do you mean?" she said, her voice still soft, but brittle at the edges. "You've been taking things from me," I continued, my voice measured, calm. "Control of my finances, my documents, my medication. You've lied to the bank. You've falsified medical information. You've isolated me. You've fed me garbage and told others I was confused. But I am not confused, Grace. I've never been clearer." Her lips parted, but nothing came out. Upstairs I heard Mitchell's footsteps. I stood and walked to the foot of the stairs, calling up, "Mitchell, you should come down." He appeared a few seconds later, still adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, clearly annoyed. "What is it now?" he said, descending 2 steps at a time. I waited until he reached the bottom, then turned back toward the small table, where a thick envelope waited. "You'll both want to see this." I opened it and spread the contents across the table. Printed statements, notarized affidavits, the lawyer's report, the APS intake form, and copies of their earlier guardianship documents, now legally invalid. "Everything you've done," I said slowly, "is recorded. And it's in the hands of people who know exactly what to do with it." They didn't move. Grace looked at the documents as though they were printed in a language she no longer understood. Mitchell's face darkened. "What are you trying to do, Howard?" he asked, dropping the pretense. You think this is some kind of victory? You're not well. You're not safe. This little rebellion of yours, it's only going to make things worse for you. I walked back to my chair, sat down, and placed my hands calmly on the arms of the chair. I've spoken to the state, to lawyers, to people who matter more than you do. They know everything, and they'll be here soon. The words hung in the air like thunder. Mitchell opened his mouth, then closed it again. Grace stepped forward, hands out, her voice trembling. Dad, please, let's just talk about this. You don't have to escalate things. I smiled. Not out of cruelty, but with a slow, exhausted understanding. Grace, I said, you escalated this when you put me in a basement and laughed over expired yogurt. You escalated it when you called me confused, when you tried to make me believe I was losing my memory, when you turned your sons against me and smiled as they mimicked your contempt. This is me finally catching up. There was a knock at the door upstairs. Mitchell froze. Grace turned pale. I didn't need to say a word. The sound of the front door opening, then voices, calm, firm, official, filled the house. I heard the word inspection, then evaluation, then compliance. Footsteps approached the top of the basement stairs. Grace turned toward me, her voice now low, vicious. You're going to regret this. I looked up at her, unmoved. I've regretted many things, I said, but not this. And then I said nothing more. The officials came down, 2 representatives from adult services, one with a clipboard, the other wearing a badge. They greeted me respectfully, addressed me as Mr. Wilson, and asked if I was comfortable speaking alone. I said yes. Grace and Mitchell were asked to step aside. Their protests were clipped and nervous. And when they finally left the room, I felt the first breath of clean air I'd had in weeks. The interview took nearly an hour. I answered everything with precision. I showed them my documentation, my journal, my financial history, the medical prescriptions that had been tampered with. I described the incidents with as much calm as I could muster, never exaggerating, never pleading, simply stating facts. When it was over, the woman with the clipboard placed a hand on my shoulder. You've done the right thing, she said gently. You've protected yourself. I wanted to believe her. But more than that, I wanted to know I was no longer invisible. They escorted Grace and Mitchell out of the house. There was no yelling, no handcuffs, just silence. Mitchell avoided my eyes. Grace looked back once from the porch, her expression unreadable, a mixture of shame, anger, and something deeper, something wounded. I did not wave, I did not speak. I simply sat at the table and waited until the front door closed again. That night I made myself a real dinner, something simple. A can of soup I'd bought myself, toast made in their overpriced toaster. It wasn't much, but it tasted like freedom. I sat in the silence of the house, now finally mine again, and felt the walls breathe with me. Not joy, not yet, but a slow unfolding relief, like something bound had finally begun to loosen. I had taken back my life. Not all of it. Not the years they had chipped away with their indifference. Not the afternoons of silence, or the birthdays forgotten, or the photographs I would never see of my grandchildren growing up. But I had taken back my name, my voice, my right to choose how I would live the years that remained. And that, I realized as I watched the wind bend the branches outside, would have to be enough. It has been 6 weeks since they left. The house is quiet again, but this time the quiet feels earned, deliberate, even protective. I wake early now, not out of habit or anxiety, but because I choose to. I drink my coffee slowly, in the chair by the window where Marlene once sat with her crossword puzzle, and I let the light come in as it pleases. The days are not filled with great ambition or grand recoveries. I do not pretend I have reversed time or rebuilt something that was broken years before the worst of it happened. But they are mine in the most basic and sacred sense. I decide what I eat. I decide when I rest. I decide what I say and who hears it. That is a freedom I had forgotten to miss until it was nearly taken for good. I have not heard from Grace since the day they left. There was a message on the machine a week after, terse and formal. We're sorry things turned out this way. I hope you're okay. I didn't return the call. I don't know that I ever will. Maybe time will soften the bitterness between us, but I am not in a hurry to test that theory. There are wounds you don't tend to, not because they're healed, but because reopening them only confirms how deep they go. I keep thinking of a photograph she once gave me years ago, framed and signed in the corner. The two of us standing beside the old Buick, her head leaning against my shoulder, her eyes full of youth and something like love. I still have it, somewhere in the drawer, though I haven't taken it out since the day I packed up their things and left them by the porch. I didn't throw anything away. I'm not angry in the way they probably assume. I'm not interested in punishment. I'm interested in peace. And to have that, I had to remove their presence from my daily life. Not violently, but entirely. A representative from the state still calls once a week to check in. They're kind, surprisingly so. One woman in particular, her name is Jessica, seems to understand without needing to ask too many questions. She helped arrange for a community health worker to stop by once a month, just to make sure everything is as it should be. She offered assisted care, physical therapy, even subsidized transportation. I declined most of it. What I needed, truly needed, was simply space, and now I have it. I walk in the mornings when the neighborhood is still asleep, slow but steady, and I've come to know the rhythms of the street again. The dog 2 houses over that always barks at the wind. The woman across the road who waters her flowers like they're her last fragile hope. They nod when they see me. I nod back. That's enough for now. I spend more time in the study these days. I've reopened some of Marlene's old journals. She had kept dozens over the years, filled with thoughts, recipes, lists of things she wanted to learn but never had time to. I find comfort in her handwriting. It's like a conversation across time. I read aloud sometimes, to no one in particular, just to hear her name in the air. There's a kind of healing in that, the gentle reaffirmation of what once was spoken into the present, like an incantation. As for the legal case, it is still pending. The documents I compiled were more than enough to open a formal investigation. Grace and Mitchell have not been charged yet, but There is a record now, a full report filed with the state. They know I am watching, that the law is watching. And if they ever attempt such quiet theft again, whether against me or someone else, there will be consequences. That, I think, is what finally shook them. Not my anger, not the confrontation, but the fact that I had quietly become more prepared than they imagined I could be. I sometimes wonder if they ever sit together in their quiet, spotless house and think about what they tried to do. If Grace remembers what it felt like to label a container for Dad and know it was spoiled. If Mitchell still believes he was in the right. Or if he ever stares at a clipboard and hears my voice saying, "You're not helping. You're finishing me off." Maybe they do. Maybe they don't. It no longer matters. Because they failed. And not just in the legal sense. They failed morally. They failed me. And that failure will remain theirs to carry. I did not seek revenge. I did not fight to destroy them. I fought to keep myself intact. The man I was, the man I remain. And that, above all, is the part they never understood. They thought this old body meant weakness, that time had eroded my memory, dulled my instincts, stripped me of courage. They were wrong. Age does not always mean surrender. Sometimes it means clarity. Sometimes it means standing still while the world tries to push you aside and saying, "No, I am still here." And I am still here, still myself, still Howard Wilson. I survived them. I survived what they tried to make me become. And I will go on, not untouched, but unbroken.